I still hear somebody's dog.
That's mine.
Let's see.
But pretty soon we're gonna hear my dog.
I haven't seen
Um,
police some days. Is this like some killer or what is
No,
Oh, this
he's
is-
extremely friendly.
it here?
I keep him in there because he'll annoy the crap out of you. Or sorry, he will annoy you.
wait a second.
He
They
will.
changed this.
I know I can read you.
Okay,
I'm actually
He,
trying to work on that with my mouth.
trying to figure this out.
he'll just be like really wanting attention for like 10 minutes. And he'll be too much. Like, on you.
Okay, here we go.
Just settle down. And then after 10 minutes, he'll be lazy and just sleep. I
You-
can bring him out, but he will be really annoying for 10 minutes.
Anyway, let's go ahead and get started, guys. So we're in Hebrews 11. We kind of got halfway through it the first week and or 2 weeks ago, and so just to kind of like review a couple things that we had we started with like the definition of a couple of words. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, is a lot of times what we have in our translations, and the evidence of things not seen. But there's a lot of different translations for these two words. So the first word in Greek is hypostasis, and it's a standing under, and it's in the sense that it's a basis, it's a foundation. So there's a couple other times that the hypostasis ended up in Hebrews in this book, and it was used in some different kinds of ways. So if you remember way back in the first chapter, it says he is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his hypostasis. A lot of times the interpretation there is the being or the nature or the substance. So that's another way to use substance in another sense of substance. He's the exact imprint of God's substance or his nature. Also in 3:14, it says, for we have become partners of Christ if only we hold our first hypostasis or confidence firm to the end. So it is also a confidence. It's translated as confidence. So some in translations will say, now faith is the confidence of things hoped for. So Amy Peeler puts it this way: if hypostasis is another way to say it, or hypostasis is something basic, in other words, the standing under or the foundation of something, if it's something firm, then it provides a place to stand from which one can hope. So we have a hope because we have a firm foundation to have that hope in. The other word is a little bit, it's the only place that it actually even occurs in the New Testament. It's the elenkos of things not seen. It's the only place that it appears on is here in the New Testament, but in the Septuagint, it appears something like 30 some times, but it's usually in a negative sense. So it's reproof or rebuke or conviction. I think a substitute word that you could use maybe is something like it's the counter evidence of things not seen. So it kind of suggests that like you're believing despite something or in the face of something. So it's not just the evidence of the things that you haven't seen, but it's the counter evidence of the things that make you think that you shouldn't believe that, right?
Even stronger than
Yeah. Yeah, so it's the truth that somebody doesn't want to hear. This is the kind of thing that would be brought in a court case as like the counter evidence, or it's kind of like, you know what, there's evidence against you, or there's evidence against that. So there's a fight somewhere in there, right? So it's the rebuttal of the things that you haven't seen. It's the counter evidence or reproof of the way the things that appear. It appears one way, but your faith tells you that, that you have counter evidence, something to fight the things that you're actually seeing. So there's one word here, hypostasis, is kind of in a positive sense, and the other one is kind of like in the negative sense, but negative because you're in a fight a lot of the times, and You're in a fight with your flesh and in a fight with the things that wants to draw you away from the faith. So today we're actually going to be talking about two Jerusalems. The New Testament writers, well, they were writing from an environment right between the time that Jesus had died, but the old covenant was still going on. So people were still, the temple was still standing, and you still had people bringing in offering. You still had a high priest. There was a lot of corruption in that system, but it was still there, right? So the New Jerusalem, in a sense, had come. The thing that that God had promised, but the old Jerusalem and the old Jerusalem system was still going on. So the New Jerusalem had come, and it was not tied to physical location. So this is something that the writer of Hebrews is going to open up now, that we've all the time been waiting for a New Jerusalem, and it's here now. It's already begun. The Jerusalem from heaven, in a way, it's got to culminate, but it's already here. So this is another thing that's kind of like, it's already here, but not yet. And this was kind of made clearer after the fact that the New Jerusalem, the physical Jerusalem, was destroyed. So like in AD 70, Rome ransacked Jerusalem. The temple was destroyed, and since then there has been no old covenant practice, honestly.
I always wondered when that actually.
Yeah, it stopped in AD 70 at the destruction of Jerusalem. There has never been a temple that was ever rebuilt. There still isn't a temple in Jerusalem. And the place where they would like to build a temple, there's a big mosque standing there. And they haven't been able to reinstate any of that. So in a sense, this had to happen because there had to be an end to the Jerusalem system and to the old covenant. And Jesus predicted that, he told his disciples, like, not one of these stones is going to be standing on top of another. So he was saying, woe to you, Jerusalem, because it's laid to you desolate. And he was basically telling his disciples in some straightforward but also roundabout ways that Jerusalem is going to get ransacked. And when you see these things happen, get out of Jerusalem. So what happened in AD 70 when the Romans went in there is that the Christians knew to get out. By and large, the Christians were saved during that, because they basically heeded the words of Jesus, and they could even look at books like Hebrews here and take little hints that it was going to come to an end, right? The Jews, on the other hand, they had started following another guy some people were following a guy that they thought was the new Messiah. And they thought, well, we're going to defeat the Romans and God is with us and all these other things. And they got run over. They got slaughtered, So it was not good. The writer of Hebrews shows that he knows that this is going to happen pretty soon. So he's writing this apparently a little bit before AD 70, probably in the 50s. When he points out what is obsolete is growing old, is about to vanish away. That's from a couple chapters ago. What is becoming obsolete and growing old is about to vanish away. So he was already telling the Hebrews of his time that, like, this old covenant system is going to die. And he's still talking about it in these chapters coming up to this point, that like we see these offerings being made, that the priest goes in once a year, and he's talking about it as if it's still going on. So we can know from that evidence that when he's writing this is still going on, but he knows it's about to end. So the old covenant has not been practiced since AD 70. Now the scripture depicts things about the coming of Jerusalem and Mount Zion. If you go back to the Old Testament, it talks about the New Jerusalem and Mount Zion. Like we can go there afterwards and look at Isaiah 66 if you want a little bit more detail about this. But some of those descriptions kind of leave you wondering, wait a minute, like if you were reading it for the first time as like somebody in the Old Testament, you're going, wait a minute, is this talking about a physical Jerusalem? And is this talking about, the Jerusalem that we're thinking in our minds here? That because what it's saying things that, like, I'm going to bring you back from your land of exile. You're going to come back here. You're going to bring Gentiles back with you. They're going to bring offerings and all that. And I'm going to make some of them Levites. And you're going, wait a minute, Levites, how can you even, if you're not even from the Levitical tribe, you can't even be a Levite as a Jew, let alone a Gentile being a Levite. That doesn't even make sense, right? So you're thinking, wait a minute, is this a physical description or is this like poetic language, right? So you have a lot of prophecies like that where you start getting hints that when you're talking about like a Jerusalem that's going to come in the future, you're not talking about the Jerusalem that in the middle of the Middle East right now, that this is something bigger and better than that, right? You're talking about a Jerusalem that's let's just say a spiritual Jerusalem, and it did happen. So it's that spiritual Jerusalem or that heavenly Jerusalem that the writer of Hebrews is talking about. So you could even say that the earthly Jerusalem, even the one that you have right now, has always been a type and a shadow of the real thing. And that sounds familiar, right? Because like everything that we've been looking at is like, like when you look at the sacrifices and the things that were going on in the temple, they were a type and shadow of what Christ would ultimately do. And when Jesus, when he's here, he's saying things like that he's the temple. And then later on, the New Testament starts writing that like we are the temple of the Holy Spirit, that God is building us up, and it's not made by human hands. So you're going to see language in this chapter about the Old Testament believer, that what they were looking for was a place, a city that was not built by human hands. So even if they were in Jerusalem at the time, they were starting to realize this is the promised land. Yeah, on one hand. On the other hand, this is far from the promised land. There's something much bigger coming. And that's the faith for that bigger thing coming, that Jerusalem that's built not with human hands is the thing that they really set their hopes up for. And that's the thing that had now come and is going to come more in full. So here's an example of this. In the next chapter, we're going to see this verse. In verse 22 of chapter 12, it says, "But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering." He's going to talk like we're already in it, that we've already come to Mount Zion, and that there's going to be that we're already surrounded by angels. In fact, he started off this chapter by saying we're surrounded by a cloud of witnesses. So he's already describing us as being there in the middle of the great assembly. Old Testament believers, New Testament believers, it's just one body. And we're there with the angels, God's throne, because Christ has made a way for us to come to the throne and to be in the Holy of Holies. And so in a sense, we're already there. Paul, and I forget where Paul writes this, he says that our citizenship is in heaven. You probably remember that. But he continues that sentence, and from it, we're already there. Like I forget where the verse is, but he's talking as if we're already in heaven, in the sense that we're from that ruling space of heaven, and it's already that heavenly Jerusalem's already a reality for us. So it's actually this whole chapter and this entire book kind of destroys this idea that there's these quote two peoples of God idea, that God's got a plan for the church and then he's got a plan for Israel. The church, all it means is that it's the assembly. It's the Old Testament believer and it's the New Testament believer. And if you're like me, you've been raised with what we would call a what do you call it? Since 300 years ago, the Darby, dispensationalist view. If you and it kind of like dispensationalism kind of like views it like, well, the church is one body and then Israel is a different body. It's not. The New Testament writers generally write from a point of view that the Gentiles have joined Israel and we're one body. Church just means the assembly, and that's that God has the common. We share the same salvation. We've seen this already in the book of Hebrews when we've been talking about. It says, that Moses was a servant in God's house, but Jesus is a son in God's house. Well, it's the same house. It's not the house of Israel and the house of the church. It's the same house. He says in another place that salvation came to us just as it came to them. It's like it's the same salvation. Salvation. It's the entire Old Testament is about the same salvation that we just see more clearly now that Christ has come. But it's the same thing. And why would we be surrounded by a cloud of witnesses if they're a different body? It makes no sense.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance that comes with like trying to separate, trying to make it like two peoples of God and make it that. And if you look at like what do you call it, commentaries from before 300 years ago, you just don't see them writing that way. They start writing that way after Darby. And I think it makes the New Testament kind of confusing to understand I think like for me, I've subconsciously adopted that point of view since I was a kid. And and I'm having to like bit by bit unravel it. I'm still hearing somebody cough. If you could mute yourself. So there's no two people's idea in scripture. The church is the assembly and includes us as well as the cloud of witnesses from the Old Testament that surround us. They too are the body of Christ. And so here's where we left off from verses 13 through 16. It says, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had an opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. We're talking about the New Jerusalem there. And here's where we pick it up in verses 17 through 19. It says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son. In the back of your mind, that he technically had another son, but we're talking about the son of promise. So in Abraham's mind, this is the son that he's been talking about. So it is his only son, and it ties up to the whole idea of God sending his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac your offspring shall be named. He's considered that God was able to raise him from the dead, from which figuratively, there's the word there in Greek is parabole or parable. It just means a type. Speaking as a type, he did receive him back. So if you go back to the Abraham story where he is about to sacrifice Jacob, it becomes a type or a parable. It's a real life parable, so to speak, of what Christ would do, what God would do in offering his son. So it's a 3-day journey to the Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah is going to be the same place that it's in Jerusalem. It's the same hilltop that the temple was built and all the sacrifices were made. It's the same hilltop that Jesus was crucified on. So he brings them to the general geographic locations. this kind of like hilltop mesa, sort of like a big area up there. But that is where he brings him. He has to travel 3 days just to bring him to the place where years and years later, the temple and the tabernacle would stand, the temple would stand, sacrifices would be made, and Jesus would be crucified. And so in Abraham's mind, his son is dead for 3 days. And here the writer of Hebrews is saying that he doesn't know how this is going to work out. He's doing it by faith. And he considered that God is able to raise him from the dead. The reasoning that the writer of Hebrews is giving for Abraham to have the faith to offer up Isaac is because he believes in the resurrection. And yeah, so, and really what he does is he actually does get his son back from the dead, because he was going to get through with it. So it says here, figuratively, in a type, he did receive him back. I put there after 3 days. So, you have Isaac carrying the wood up the hill, like Jesus carried the cross. Before they even leave, he says, Dad, where's the sacrifice? And Abraham says, God will provide himself a sacrifice. So even before he leaves, he says something prophetic that God is going to provide a sacrifice. And ultimately, of course, God does provide a sacrifice for all of us on that same hill. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. So he's like, when you get out of here, I want my bones taken out of Egypt, and I want to have them buried in the promised land, or back where Abraham, back where my grandfather Abraham had been promised that land. So, they're looking for something to be happening in the future. The faith of Moses. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw the child was beautiful. That's kind of like, it sounds weird to us. It's like, oh, this is a beautiful child, we'll save this one.
Yeah.
It's not. If you were here, I mentioned a little while ago that we did a series on seeing and taking. It goes back to this idea that when God created the heavens and the earth, and he saw that it was good, and he saw that it was good. The word there is tov, and he saw that it was tov. Next time you see somebody seeing that something was tov is Eve. She saw that the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil was tov. So there's a tension there. Wait a minute. God saw that it was tov. She sees that it's tov. Yeah, it's tov. Tov and ra. The tov for good, ra we translate as evil, right?
But they both to see good or see evil.
Well, what she does is that so like the way that's written is like you're supposed to think, wait a minute, okay, she sees that it's good, but what's going to result from it is something way different than like when God saw something was good. And so you have all these narratives after that where somebody, a Bible character will see something as tov and they'll try to take it for themselves, just like Eve did. Like Potiphar's wife sees Joseph that he's tov. It gets translated handsome or whatever, but it's the same word. And she tries to take him. David with Bathsheba, he sees that she's tov, tries to take it. There's all these seeing and taking. But there's one, the first time where you see that God says he sees something as raw, that he sees that it's evil, right? Is when he looks at, before the Noah story, he sees that man's intent was raw all the time. It was evil all the time. Yeah, that's that RAH, or well, or that's kind of like how we translated it. So then you're like, okay, but Noah was was found to be tamim in his generations. We remember that tamim word?
Pure.
Yeah, or that blameless, right? Okay, so what happens is that when you get to the Moses story, you see he's gonna drown in the and be killed and thrown into the Nile and everything. But yeah, and so it has to do with the water, but also he's put in an ark, the ark of salvation, right? So now you've got like a situation where they see that he's Tov, but they don't try to take him for himself. They put him in the ark of salvation and put him among the reeds. So there's like all these, this play, like it's like that music, like where you see that music come back and you hear that theme again. It's a little bit different this time, but you're supposed to think about it. So
Isn't there something in the word reeds too?
yeah. It's like in the reeds is like where they hide him in the reeds. The implication is that they're throwing the dead babies into the reeds. And then at the end of the narrative, of course, Pharaoh's army drowns in the sea of reeds. So there's wordplay with that. It's not the Red Sea, it's the Sea of Reeds. So in any case, but that's, he brings up that they saw that the child was Tov. Of course, it's
So it could just mean good.
yeah, it can just mean good. It gets translated beautiful because I think when they translate it into Greek, because it can be translated as beautiful. That's, I think, how they translate it into Greek from the Hebrew, to be beautiful. So they're more specific for us. But in the Old Testament, in the original Hebrew, it's Tov each time. Yeah, Tov and Ra. Yeah, like go back, like look at that video. I did like a little mini series on, and so did the Bible Project. Did a thing on that. Yeah, seeing and taking and all that. Yeah. So verse 24, by faith, Moses, when he was growing up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. So he's got a choice to make here. He had grown up to be a dignitary. He's going to be in the royal household, not just an Egyptian that's like not under slavery, but he's going to be in charge. He's going to be a lawmaker and all that kind of stuff, right? But he chose instead to be identified with the people who were slaves. So the only reason to do that for him, if you think about it, is because because he's got claims to do either one. He can legitimately do either one, as he's bona fide adopted, into that royal family. He can just say, I am an Egyptian and I'm in the Egyptian royal household. But he just chooses to identify with the Israelites because he has faith. There's something that tells him, I would rather put myself at risk and die and be identified as a slave and with these people than carry on being an Egyptian dignitary, right? So he now catch this in verse 26. This sounds really weird to us. Okay, he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to, and in the King James it says, had respect for the reward. So he's got. It's kind of like that fear thing. Do you fear God or you fear man? Well, it's like, do you respect God more? Do you respect man more? Doesn't mean that you're totally not afraid of what man can do to you, because man can hurt you and can harm you. But who do you fear? It's like it's a balancing thing. Like, who do you fear more? But here's what I'm bringing you: the reproach of Christ. Does he know who Christ is? Yeah, it's like, well, he certainly doesn't know who Jesus is. So how in the world is the writer of Hebrews connecting this idea of the reproach of Christ? So in other words, the reproach of because what Moses is looking at is the reproach of the Israelite people. the people of God, actually, right? He's looking at, he'd rather be suffer the reproach of the people of God than embrace the treasures of Egypt. So I found I'm just going to quote Donald Hagner here. He says the reference to Christ is an anachronism. An anachronism is like where you have something out of place in time. So like if you see a Roman soldier with a hair dryer, or if you see like one of our founding fathers and he's on a cell phone or something like that, you're like, that's an anachronism. It's kind of like, that doesn't belong with that time. How does that work, right? So the reference to Christ is an anachronism explained by the final clause of verse 26, quote, "For he was looking to the reward." As we have repeatedly seen, an essential quality of having faith is being motivated by future and the unseen. In other words, Moses is seeing something and has his eyes on something in the future. He doesn't know the name Jesus, or who that person is going to be. He has probably a general sense of this. He does have the promise of salvation, and he knows that it's connected to the people of God. Okay, so the basis for the anachronistic statement is located in the, get this, the unity of salvation history and the unity of God's people. So this whole thing has been about salvation history for the old covenant and for the new covenant. As we've seen, the new covenant was the fulfillment of the old covenant. The old covenant was a model for the realities that Christ would bring. Even the old Jerusalem, or the earthly Jerusalem, is a model for the heavenly reality which we are a part of, right? So he is, so the writer of Hebrews is taking a little bit of license here, but he's connected Moses's faith to the fact that God does have salvation planned for him, and he knows that. He knows not just that, like that Israel is going to escape out of Egypt. Even Israel escaping out of Egypt is a model for us escaping out of sin. There's a bigger reality that all of that points to. Israel's history, the people, and everything. The background for that is that something like this is going to happen, but it's much bigger than anything that we've recorded in the Old Testament or Tanakh, right? Directly. So when Moses suffered, he continues here, when Moses suffered reproach, he was loyal to God's people in verse 25. So in effect, he suffered reproach for being loyal to God's Messiah. When you look at the prophecies about God's Messiah, especially in Isaiah, it sometimes when we're talking about the suffering servant, he was bruised for our iniquities and chastisement, a lot of old scholars interpret that as, and Jews nowadays will interpret that as it's talking about Israel. Israel is the suffering servant. And they have a case because when you read Isaiah, there's a lot of passages that connect Israel as being that suffering servant. It's just that if you keep on reading, then you're going, you know what? It's focusing on Israel, but then it's focusing in something smaller. It's focusing on one person, and that represents all of Israel. So Jesus represents all of Israel in the book of Isaiah. So it's like, in a sense, yeah, it's Israel, but like you keep on reading, it's like, you know what? This is actually more about a particular person in Israel, and he represents all of Israel. So Israel is actually this Messiah's body, so to speak. So it's the same kind of language that gets picked up in the New Testament about us being Christ's body. It gets simplified in a way, but it's always been there, even in the Old Testament. So when Moses suffered the reproach, he was loyal to God's people in verse 25. In effect, he suffered reproach for being loyal to God's Messiah, who is closely identified with God's people. The anachronism very deliberately has the readers in mind. So it's really talking to the Hebrews that the Hebrews that he's addressing right then, since they are the ones called by their faithfulness to bear the reproach of Christ in this epistle. So like in the next chapter or in chapter 13, it's actually going to, I'll show you that first in a second. The reward that Moses would enjoy in the future and that he counted upon in his faith was far greater than the reward that Egypt had to offer. Let me see if I have this. Yeah, from chapter 13. So 2 chapters later, it's going to say this. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured. He's telling these Hebrews, you're going to be suffering for your faith. And some of you guys, you haven't resisted to the point of blood yet, but you will. Some of you are going to die for your faith. Okay. And go ahead and do it and embrace that fact, because in verse 14, for here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come. Here again, he's talking about the New Jerusalem. We're not looking at this Jerusalem, which is going to be destroyed and which is persecuting you anyway. The whole Jerusalem system is persecuting you. Embrace that and bear the reproach of Christ with his people and with his body and with him, because you're not looking for a city here. You're not looking for approval here. You are looking for something that is to come.
What do you think about the outside the campus?
Oh, so like if you sacrificed, so yeah, if you sacrificed the animal died outside the camp, just like Jesus was brought to the outskirts of the city or of the hilltop, right? But the blood is the life. So you got the death on the outside, but you have the blood, which represents the life of the sacrifice that's brought into the Holy of Holies. What Christ is presenting is his own life in front of in the Holy of Holies right now. It's not his death. It's not being killed over and over, and he's not representing his death all over and over again. He's representing his blood, which is his life and which cleanses us. So that's kind of like so here's more commentators. So you know how like when you go onto the Blue Letter Bible things, when they've got all these commentaries, it's like they've got like Matthew Henry and all these old commentators. Here's some of the things that they said about this passage, where it's talking about, it says, throughout the whole of their history, the people of Israel were the people of Christ. So think about that. See, this is probably written more than 300 years ago. Same thing with Fawcett Brown, okay? It's before dispensationalism. But that you don't see, this is what they're seeing, okay? The history of the people of Israel were the people of Christ. Abraham was a person of Christ. These were all people who died in Christ. They didn't have the full sense of it, but they are part of that body. They're part of our body, okay? Their national existence originated in the promise to Abraham, which was a promise of the Christ. Until the fullness of time should come, their mission was to prepare the way for him. That's Ellicott. Jameson, Fawcett Brown, they say, the reproach of Christ, that is the reproach which falls on the church, and which Christ regards as his own reproach, he being the head, the church, both the Old and the New Testament, his body. So both the Old Testament and the New Testament believer are his body, okay? Israel typified Christ. Israel's sufferings were Christ's sufferings. It's like back to that idea that you find in Isaiah. That's them. So like, and here's kind of like an example. They cite, Colossians 1:24. So I looked it up. It says, this is Paul talking. He says, now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake, and in my flesh I am filling up what is lacking in Christ's afflictions for the sake of his body, that is the church. Yeah, filling up what is lacking in Christ's afflictions. He's identifying the suffering of the church as the afflictions of Christ. The afflictions of Christ as the man who died on the cross is represented by his entire body and is represented by Israel, the suffering servant. It's his body.
It's filling up.
Filling up. Yeah, this Colossians 1:24 has always like bugged me, but I think I see it like more like 90% now as opposed to, like 30%.
I like that you're willing to say that.
Yeah. Filling up.
I don't like that.
Well, I think what he's saying is that like he's not like trying to escape the fact that he's suffering for Christ. He's like, hey, I'm down for it, kind of like what what's his name? And so since Jesus also suffered outside the gate, therefore let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured. It's kind of along the same lines, right? That he's saying, I'm going to bear the reproach of Christ, and what his body is suffering, and I'm filling that up instead of trying to run away from it.
Filling myself with wrath.
Yeah, we have this idea, I think, and I've heard people say it, Jesus suffered so I don't have to. None of the Old New Testament writers write that way. None of them talk that way. Yeah, they kind of like take it for granted that like if you are one of Christ, you will suffer tribulation in this world,
Yeah, they were
but don't
the
fear
martyrs
because
and
Christ has
stuff.
overcome the world, right?
They were even, like, burned in Rome and stuff. Huh?
Yeah, I mean this was a tough time, and it's a very tough time for a lot of Christians around the world right now. So verses 27 through 29, by faith, Moses, he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. So again, like you're thinking, well, he was afraid, he was kind of freaked out, but who did he fear more? It's a comparative statement. He didn't fear the Pharaoh like he feared God, and he had faith in God. For he endured as seeing him who is invisible. So again, he's got the confidence of things not seen. By faith, he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. Now you think of like Moses and any of these guys, Abraham, they're very imperfect in their faith, very imperfect. It's actually a comforting thought to me, because I am very imperfect in my faith too. And think of this, the Israelites, they crossed the Red Sea as on dry. By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea. These are the same people who were left in the desert to, because of their unfaithfulness.
Yeah, the most forgetful people.
Yeah, but they did have faith. They did step into, water on both sides, catastrophe looming, anything could go wrong. They did cross, and they were spared. And the Egyptians who tried to do things the same thing, they were not spared. So so that was a moment of faith. They did follow on that. So imperfect faith for sure. Abraham, yeah, and here you're going to see like other names here. And for Abraham, we see, well, he had poor faith at first. He was trying all these things, and then his faith grew, and he ended up in a lot better place in his faith than he started out in. Other people like David, they started all off all rah, and then got worse, and kind of didn't end as well. Yeah. So there's a mixture there. It's not just that like everybody seemed to grow and grow and grow in their faith. They have really imperfect stories with their faith, from all angles. Verse 31, 31. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. So yeah, it's like, wow, this seems like a really useless exercise unless you have faith that God is actually going to destroy that city based on us marching around it and then blowing trumpets.
They could have been scared too, that, how do they know that at any moment archers aren't gonna start raining?
Right, yeah, like you're gonna go outside city walls, you're in a sketchy position, yeah. And then get this, by faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. Think about this. Who were those who were disobedient?
Yeah, that's weird.
Yeah, because like you're going, well, is it like she didn't perish with Jericho? Because was Jericho being disobedient to God? I mean, Yahweh wasn't their God. Now think about,
Should have been though from the nomadic to,
you can make a case for that, but in the book of Hebrews, who is the book of Hebrews writer talking about when he talks about those who were disobedient? He's talking about the Israelites, right? So you had a whole generation of Israelites who were disobedient, but you had Rahab after them saying, I believe this God. So the story of Rahab is put in juxtaposition or in contrast with the disbelievers of Israel in the desert.
when it means perish, it's really meaning that they just didn't enter the promised land.
They didn't, yeah, they perished. They didn't enter the promised land. You had all these things that like the writer of Hebrews talked about, like they did not enter God's rest because of their disbelief. They were disobedient, and so they didn't, like go on. So he is contrasting Rahab with those people.
The unfaithful Jews.
Right.
He's comparing her faith
Yeah. So
to the disobedient Jews' lack of faith.
so think about like this: the spies go in 40 years before this, right? The spies.
Oh, that was 40 years.
Yeah, it was like a long time. I forget when the spies went in. Maybe that was, a little after they've been in the desert for a while. I don't remember the chronology of that. But the spies go in and they come back, and what did they report to the Jews, right? And what did they said, they're giants in the land. We can't take them. We're like ants, and they're, we can't take this land, right? What's Rahab tell them when? Okay, so now you've got a second set of spies. Okay, the second set of spies goes in and they talk to Rahab, and Rahab goes, yeah, we fear you guys because we heard what happened at the Red Sea. We heard what happened when these people tried to attack you, etc. And like what your God did. We've been trembling in fear this whole time. So the spies 40 years ago had said something to the Jews. We can't take these people, and we're afraid of them, and they're not afraid of us. And Rahab, in her, like 40 years later, the spies come to her, and she tells these new spies, "Oh, we've been shaking in our boots, right? And yeah, I'll help you guys out because, like, think of it, if she helps these spies and Jericho doesn't go down, what do you think's going to happen to Rahab? She's dead woman, right?" So she has faith that God is going to deliver Jericho into the hands of Yahweh. Yeah. So she's like, I believe in Yahweh, even though a bunch of you guys didn't.
Now she didn't really say it like that.
She didn't really say it like that.
That's what the writer of
But this is this is where what the writer of Hebrews is kind of like implicating here. She did not perish with those who were disobedient. In other words, the people in the desert, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. She changed teams. She didn't stick with the gods of Jericho.
a risky life decision.
Yeah, she's making a risky life decision, and she was giving her believing loyalty to a God who wasn't hers. She's like, I believe Yahweh. I don't believe these gods of Jericho. Because whoever this Yahweh is, we've heard about them. We've been trembling in our boots, and we've got good reason to. I'm with you guys. I'll help you out. And she actually becomes the great grandmother of David, and eventually, so she's in the lineage of Jesus.
And it says who she married into with the Jew.
Yeah. Actually, Matthew has a record of that, I think. Yeah. So here's an example of success in this life. What more shall we say? For time would fail to tell me of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah. Those are all like in the book of the Judges, and of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith they conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Right? Women received back their dead by resurrection. So if you're thinking about like the widow in Elisha's widow, she gets back her son from the dead and stuff like that. So these are all like successful things in this life, that were done by faith. But the other half of this paragraph is storing up the rewards for the next life. Others were tortured, refusing to accept release so they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom this world is not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth. So we love this stuff in America, right? Well, we love this anywhere. Just the stories of, like the successes that you can have from faith. And there are successes that you can have from faith.
Loves those, like,
Yeah.
prosperity ones.
Right. But just as much of a faith story of the people who are looking for not just this life, but the life after this, that they would rise again to a better life. He's talking about the Old Testament. They believe in the resurrection. They're seeing the resurrection. Okay. And when Paul's talking about the dead in Christ rising, the dead in Christ will rise, and us who've been who have survived basically to the end will join them in the air and all that kind of stuff. It's talking about the Old Testament believers. It's talking about the New Testament believers.
Not ones from just couple.
Yeah, it's not just it's not
decades.
from AD 32 on or anything like that. It's just like the resurrection that Daniel believed in, the resurrection that Job believed in when he said, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and I'll see him on that day after my flesh has been burnt up, or like yet in my flesh I know I will see God." When he stands upon the earth, that means the coming of Christ. When you read chapter 37 of Ezekiel, and it talks about like the dead bones rising, that's not about 1948 and the rebirth of Israel in modern day times, because it's talking about the resurrection. And when you read that, you're going, wow, David's going to be their king. That's a nickname for the Messiah or Christ, right? And you're going, oh, wait a second. Where's the Christians in this? Because all I see is Judah and Israel, and I see Judah and I see Ephraim. Until you start figuring out, right? Yeah, until you start figuring out, wait a minute, we're included in there. This is like, it's like the New Testament believer Gentiles is included in that whole scenario, because Christ is that's what we're waiting for, Christ to be king. You're grafted into that Judah and Manasseh and Ephraim scenario. Yeah, read Ezekiel 37. That's you included there, and I believe it to be when he makes the one staff out of Judah and Ephraim there. I believe that we're part of that Ephraim thing. I can go into that afterwards, but they refuse to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. A lot of people think that this is from the stories in Second Maccabees. So if you read Second Maccabees chapter 7, I believe, probably Aaron has already read it. There's a story about like this woman and her sons who enticed Epiphanes soldiers are trying to, go against what they believe, and they said no. And she's got 7 sons, and they're all being tortured and killed off in front of her one by one. and she's yelling at them, don't give in to them. She knows that they're going to die, but she's like, because and they're saying things, I'm going to have a better resurrection because of this. They're all talking about like, I'm going to resurrect, and my torturers aren't. It's kind of like what they're saying throughout that whole thing. So a lot of people, like, because you're going, where were they tortured and refusing to be released? Where was that in the Old Testament? And so a lot of them,
Kind of happening around the time of this writing too, right?
I think that like I don't think that the Romans had started killing them yet. No, that was still to come. They were being ostracized, they were being beaten and put in prison and stuff, but they hadn't, like in Hebrews it says, you have not resisted to the point of shedding blood yet. But that the implication is that is coming. So it hadn't happened for them yet. But so the question was, well, what is the writer referring to? And he's probably talking about the time of the Maccabees, because there were a lot of Jews who refused to eat pork or bow to the Greek gods or anything, and they were actually tortured and killed, and they were citing that they were going to resurrect. They believed in resurrection for sure. Everything changed after AD 70. The Judaism that you have nowadays is not the Judaism that you had before AD 70.
I wonder if their
It's
explanation is that they think that
It's Talmudic. They're into the Talmud. It's not really, Torah is kind of like its thing, but they kind of like put it on equal grounds with the writings of the Talmud. And there's all these different factions and stuff, but yeah, modern day Judaism. Yeah, modern day Judaism is nothing like Judaism before 87. So others severed mocking and flogging, even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two. I think it was the prophet Zephaniah or Zechariah that was sawn in two. Don't quote me. They're killed with the sword. Anyway, it says here in verse 38, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth. They had fled Antiochus Epiphanes. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised. They none of them received what was promised. Even since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. You almost feel like it should be said that apart from them, we should not be made perfect, right? It's almost like assuming their salvation and the thing that they were hoping for, and then but it's not going to be given apart from us too. Just think about it like, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. I'm not going to I'm not going to complete you until I get these people in who've seen the Christ. So
like what we've been reading in Revelation too.
yeah, so faith. So in other words, the whole thing ties us to the Old Testament believer, and we share the same inheritance as they do. It's the same inheritance. So here's another thing that Donald Hagner wrote. So more Donald Hagner, but as wonderful as God's work was in the past, it pales in comparison with what God now has done in Christ. We have reached a new stage in the history of salvation. So there's a history of salvation that's described.
Started with Christ, but
Yeah, Christ was the lamb slain from the foundations of the world. He's always been the one through whom salvation would come. And whether you were before the cross or after the cross, you had faith in God to provide that, whether no matter how much or little you understood of it. So this is modestly expressed as something better for us in verse 40. We have repeatedly seen the word better in Hebrews to describe the advantages of the new covenant over the old. Old covenant saints and the covenant saints, and the new covenant saints have the same inheritance. We have the same inheritance, as stated, okay? The result is that those in the past cannot be brought to the ultimate goal to be made perfect apart from us. They had, we're going to be made perfect together and sharing the same inheritance. It's the grand story of salvation. All will come together to enjoy one great and final salvation, perfectly realized. This will be the reward for those who believed and who expressed their faith, thereby giving, I love this sentence. This will be the reward for those who believed and who expressed their faith, thereby giving faith substance and providing evidence of the unseen and of the things yet to come. We share in their faith. And the writer of Hebrews is saying, we've got all these witnesses of faith from the past who are rooting us on. We need to hold on to the same faith, especially now that we have Christ. And don't fall from Christ, because that is who they were waiting for. So
Much is given, much is required.
yeah.
We've had so much more knowledge and stuff put on our plate than all those Old Testament guys had,
Yeah. So
That's the last of it.
that's the last of chapter 11. Yeah, we'll start in chapter 13. We'll start in chapter 12. The climax of the book is in chapter 12. And so, we'll be looking forward to that. Everything's going to start kind of like, everything's going to be like, put together in chapter 12, all the themes of the book or whatever, So, it's a lot, huh?
Yeah, I've really gotten a lot from the Hebrews is all the tying in with the Old Testament and and that's always, it's weird because that's almost been like an emotional thing for me lately too. And I think I got it from you even talking before we started the study is the Michael Heisner, is that his name?
Michael Heiser.
Yeah, Heiser, like the context of thinking of how the Bible's written at the time to those people,
Right.
And then, so we're putting our place in the place of the New Testament people, but he was asking them to put themselves in the place of the Old Testament people in a sense too, like
Yeah.
how the Hebrews was written. And
Well, and they could, because they hadn't grown up as being Christians for the most part, unless they were real young. They've been the Hebrews had grown up going to the temple and to the synagogues and seeing the sacrifices and making journeys, or like I don't know if it's written in Jerusalem, but they knew the Jerusalem system. And now they've come to Christ and go, this is what we've been waiting for.
I guess it's cool to me. It's just since I started going to men's, like going from kind of just always being a loner to like kind of being the community, and then like really thinking it throughout all its history that like Abraham was looking to the same thing we were looking to. It's a pretty cool feeling.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's a very technical word.
Yeah.
But
yeah, they're seeing through the glass darkly even more. We're still seeing through the glass darkly.
Yeah, it was an academic.
yeah, I kicked out of high school, so I love it. I'm agreeing with his word. I love it.
Well,
Cool, pretty cool.
It was rad.
That's rad.
I like learning this.
Oh, there she is. I don't know. It's just God made our emotions too. That's part of God gave us feelings too, and it's that feeling of connectedness. I think I'm saying too. I think that's why the men's has been growing. It's that feeling of camaraderie, like the connectedness, and like that's how I feel like with Abraham. I'm like, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Walking through the desert. I was at Joshua Tree last night and this morning, and I was like, yeah, just for one night. But like, I'm like, man, our ancestors have been walking through deserts for thousands of years, man. Except they didn't have the security knowing their vehicle was parked, a couple miles away. But it's people. No, just Rodney Mateo.
I think like the biggest thing for me, like from Hebrews, like where you feel a connection to the Old Testament believer, is the idea of being exiles on the earth.
You know how that feels sometimes.
So we talked last week about like that German word Fernweh, where you're homesick for a place that you've actually never been.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And then C.S. Lewis having that whole concept of like where if you're hungry, well, there is such a thing as food. You know, if you desire sex, well, there is such a thing as sex. So all these things that you can have cravings and hungers for, there's a certain thing that you have a craving and hunger for that you don't see in this world. And
Well, that's one of the things that led him to believe, huh?
that, yeah, and he's like, there's got to be an answer for that. You know, like that's got to exist somewhere. But and I think that like that's something that like humanity has always sensed, that like there's something beyond, there's something more to this. There's got to be something more.
Yeah.
And it doesn't exist anywhere in his life, because even like the writer of Ecclesiastes is like, I collected all those things. I did everything that you can imagine, and I had more power than you can imagine. I did all these things, and it's all meaningless. And I think it's a long way of saying, you got to trust God that because there is something beyond this life, because this life there's no way that it can fill it. So yeah, he says, if I find myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy it, the only logical explanation is that I was made for another world.
Mhm.
And that kind of gives you comfort that like, well, you can have peace with that, because you quit looking for the world to give you that answer.
Relax knowing
You,
that.
you can relax knowing that, like, I'll go to my grave never having truly experienced it. You can in part, because it's already here and not yet. There is that God-shaped hole that can be filled, but you still have life, and you're still in exile in this world. And you will be until the New Jerusalem. You are still looking and putting your hopes for that city not made by human hands. And that's really what you're hoping for. And that's what connects you to Abraham. Because Abraham's like, I'm never going to see this place. I'm not even going to see. And he went to the promised land, and he lived in tents the whole time. He's like a nomad in the place that was promised to him. And he died that way,
Yeah,
being a nomad
He
in the
never
place.
had a built out.
No.
He never had like a built out fortified structure. He lived
Right.
in- It was always a feeling of
Right.
temperament, like yeah.
And then you get David, and it's like, boy, he's got a kingdom there and everything. And then he's writing Psalms that you're going, wow, he's really still looking for something else. And he's writing the thing that like in Hebrews is quoted. It's like, don't fall into disbelief unless you're going to miss out on God's rest, like they did in the desert. I'm paraphrasing, right?
Mhm.
So where he's going, well, wait a minute, that rest. So the rest wasn't what Joshua conquered and they were brought to the promised land. That wasn't rest. That wasn't the rest they were looking for. And David, who's king, is saying, no, that rest still exists, but it's not here. And don't fall into disbelief lest you miss out on that rest and that peace, because he knows this isn't it either. And he's in the middle of Jerusalem as king saying this. So
What's so odd about this? I mean, people of the world are like, well, you're not grateful, you're not sad. Why aren't you satisfied with this? This should be enough. I'm like, because this is not it.
yeah,
They're like, well, what do you mean? You have this, and this, and this. And again, I'm like, and that it's like hard to explain to them, like, because it's not it.
there's
It's not that you're wanting more, you're wanting the last piece of the puzzle or the
I want the
complete.
real deal.
And if
perfect
they're
means-
honest, they feel
Yeah.
the same way.
Mhm.
Yeah,
If they're honest, at the end of the night, they're like, is this all there is?
Yep,
I wonder sometimes. I wonder.
At least
they
they'll
convince
come to
themselves.
that point at some point.
well, the dissatisfaction I think that the Christian has is a different kind of dissatisfaction than what the world has.
Yeah, because they don't understand. their
Well,
dissatisfaction.
it comes from the same place maybe, but it's not,
But
it's like,
it-
there's supposed to be a whole pie, right? And like God's love is perfect. That means you can't add more to it and you can't take away. It's like perfect. Like if you add more, then it's not perfect anymore either. So until we are connected with the Father, we're missing that slice of the pie too. It
Right.
hasn't been perfected yet, right?
I think, well, and the difference is, well, you have a relationship with the person who is going to satisfy it, and you have faith because it's the evidence of the things you haven't seen yet. So the world is like, I'm dissatisfied and I just haven't found that thing here in this world, and I'm looking for it, and I'm going to try to fill it with all kinds of things until, like, or just do the best I can, or try to be as satisfied as I can, or something like that, right? And ignore. Whereas the Christian is like,
We're more honest about it.
I want something more. This world isn't going to provide it, but I want something. Not only do I want something more, I want something more to the degree where I'm looking for where God has promised that, like, it's beyond what I can measure or think of, or like Paul said, no mind has seen, no eye has seen, what God has prepared for those who love him, beyond what we can think, dream, or imagine. It's beyond all of that, and it's kind of like your heart is still yearning for that. But you're more satisfied in the sense that you've already got a relationship and a faith in the one who's going to provide it.
More like the world has a question mark there. We have like the coupon in our hand, we just haven't received it yet.
Yeah.
But they have like,
Is it kind of like with Esau, how he sold his birthright for a single morsel of food to satisfy that hunger, and sold the blessing, basically, that he had the right to receive, but he sold it for one meal, and just for that temporary satisfaction.
that's a good example of the world too. Huh?
Yeah, I think that is kind of like an example of the world, because Jacob had faith. He was a conniver, and he did everything wrong, right? But what he had going for him was that he was extremely dissatisfied just by the way he was living, but he was going to get that blessing one way or another. And he was going to wrestle God for it. Yeah, the supplanter, he did, but God changed his name. Remember, he changed it from Jacob, the supplanter, to Israel. You know what Israel means?
We wrestle with God.
You wrestle with God.
And the Jews have been wrestling with God forever.
We have been wrestling with God
yes.
because we're Israel. If you welcome to the family, if you've gotten saved, you're part of Israel and you wrestle with God. But that's kind of like where it's not that like, oh geez, now that you're saved, you're supposed to be fine and dandy with everything and satisfied with it. No, you still wrestle with the flesh. It's because remember, it's like, I'm changing your name to Israel because you have wrestled with God and man, right? Because you're wrestling with men too, men's point of views, your own flesh, etc., and prevailed. And it wasn't just
Does
that.
Israel have that? Is that part of the name too? That
Yeah, well, it's not part of the name, but like that's the reasoning that like that God gives him when he names him Israel. He says, you wrestled with God and man and you prevailed. It's like, well, because you beat God in a wrestling match. It's not exactly, it's that like you've prevailed because like you're because you're not like Esau. You know, like there's a sense in which Jacob was kind of like, I want the blessing of God. I want what he's promised. And he did all these, you know, things, totally unnecessary things. You know, he could have received it by faith, but he had enough faith to go after it.
Sounds like someone I know, a lot of us, you know, doing
Yeah.
unnecessary things.
Yeah. You know, it's like, so on one hand, it's like, yeah, you are blessed, you know, and you can take that for granted, and God has blessed you and given you promises and provision, and his yoke is easy, you know. There is rest that you can go into right now. But there is still, you know, like that you just got to remember that you're in exile on the earth. You're still in exile, and humanity is in exile.
I always think that's strange when I think of the cross, like being a Christian bearing the cross. They were getting sawn in half and all this stuff. And then when Jesus says his yoke is easy, I always like, not that things can't be two things at once, but I'm like, man, carrying a cross isn't easy. But then Jesus describes his yoke as being easy, you know, and I always think like those are kind of contrasting images, you know, that of what our life as a Christian should be like.
Yeah.
But you know what though, even bearing the cross in the times that are hard, there is an essence of easiness of it, because we know, we have a knowledge. And I guess that's where the peace of mind and the easiness comes in, maybe.
Yeah, and there's that tension between the idea that like where Jesus is saying, pick up your cross and follow me if you want to be my disciple. You know, like it is basically like count yourself dead. You know, pick up your cross and follow me. It's like if he who loses his life for my sake will gain it, and those who try to, you know, keep their life are going to lose it. And that whole, I think it's in John chapter, I don't know, 8 or something. But that whole chapter, he says a whole bunch of things like to that same effect. You know, where it says, pick up your cross and follow me. It's all about like death and like, you know, somebody saying, you know, and but there is a freedom in the sense that like once you stop living for this life and you realize that I'm not living for here and now, that in a sense it should become more easy,
There's total freedom.
because there's a
Yeah.
freedom in that. You're like, yeah, you're like, well, I'm dead. I'm a walking dead, you know, because I'm alive in Christ and I'm dead to this flesh now. And I've kissed this old life goodbye, and I'm not putting my hope in it anymore.
I was gonna say, Aaron, with the carrying the cross, at least my strength is when I'm carrying, it's not so bad. It's the thought of having to pick that and let up again. I'm like, that's the part I didn't have issue with. I'm like, I don't want to carry it anymore. But 7 months I do when I'm in the process of the action of it. It's like since it was, I don't know why that is, but it's when I put it down and I think about it, I'm like, God, that process heavy.
I think there's a security, even if it's heavy, it's like we know where we're going. Yeah. Yeah, I don't want to have to put it down and start all over again.
When I set it down, nothing goes right up forward. You know what I mean? I try to put it down. So I'm not coming back that whole one over everything. You know, I bitch and complain about it, but that's like the worldly part of it. It's only when I'm actually bearing a cross, like super strong inside. It's like this is what I'm supposed to be doing.
Yeah, there's a rest that comes in knowing you're doing what you're supposed to be doing.
That's my preference.
And then isn't that like him being true to his word, like he's saying like it's like we have that tension, that you know we're supposed to pick up our cross and follow him, and it's really hard to understand that that's the truth. And then it's also the truth that when you come to him, his burden is light. And he's like, take my burden, it's light. And it's not like, it's like something that you can't really explain, except that the Holy Spirit explains it to you, you know, like we have that peace. And the Bible does say it passes all understanding, like how can you actually comprehend that? In the midst of great suffering, people can have great peace. In the midst of great suffering, people can have great joy. And it's only because of the Lord, you know, like it's a miracle. Like our non-saved friends will never understand that unless they come to him and find it for themselves.
Let's say, like, his burden is light, it's the worldly burden that's heavy. Really, if it's really his burden, that is pretty light, pretty easy. But when it's the worldly burden, that's what's heavy. The things
The
that
worldly burden pushes people to suicide.
it does, and that's where war comes from. Like you got, like I cry all the time, guys know blessing, but I'm not doing this. You guys have the choice. It's because people have the choice or to do it. So don't be mad at me. It's because of choosing it, and that's the heaviness that you feel. When you do what you're supposed to. How do you feel? I feel really good. But when but
Yeah, a lot of the things we complain about in the shows. I like when Don said that at his testimony like 2 weeks ago. He said after like 7 years of being divorced, he finally got that God's like, I didn't tell you to marry her. That lady, you married her. He goes, that was your decision, like. And I think that with Christians, what we don't like sometimes is we want God to always tell us what to do, or like, you know what I mean? But really,
Yes, of
he's like, you're the thing is like. You have two choices. You have all kinds of choices all day long, you know? Like, and then I don't even know where we're at now. But we're meandered probably.
that quote is so good, and that's what I wrote that down. And I was like, okay,
Yeah,
that was that whole testament of this, but when he said that, when he was pouring, I said, this is the one I want to make. It was so clear. He just said, how is that? Is absolutely not the truth.
Well, I thought it
It's God saying, well, I didn't choose that for you. You chose that.
the
I didn't tell you,
Israelites,
Mayor.
the Israelites chose to worship other gods.
Yep.
They chose to like,
Yeah, and the judgment that God has on Israel all the time is that he hands them over to the consequences of their own
you
decisions.
know, that's great.
You know, it's like that's been kind of like usually like when you do some digging, you'll find out like when you see God's judgment, a lot of times you see like that it's not, you know, like, well, God taking action in the
It's
sense
more
of
like
him it's him, you know, like saying, handing you over, like Romans 1, you know, because of man's unbelief and because of this sin, that he hands them over to reprobate mind. He hands them over, you know, like the consequences of their decision, you know. There's, you know.
Can you guys help me with the song that's been going through my head? Don't sing it on me.
Okay.
Because you guys keep on saying it. The old Cottonwood album, you filled in the country soul.
Oh.
I only remember the one line, and I know there's more than just that line.
Oh man.
Gary, have you been at Cottonwood since the Sausalito days too?
You stepped into control.
Yeah,
You filled in.
I think he's on mute.
Something like that.
Gary,
Nobody can help me out.
Yeah, I was
there?
on mute.
hey Gary, how long have you been at Cottonwood?
I started going